This is a 2006 Ferrari 612 Scaglietti, and it is one of my favorite modern Ferrari models. Now, I know it's not one of the most beautiful modern Ferrari models, but it is reasonably reliable, surprisingly practical, and shockingly thrilling to drive. And today, I'm going to review this one and show you what I mean. Before I get started, big news, this 612 is currently listed for sale live right now on Cars and Bids, my enthusiast car auction website. This 612 just had a $20,000 service to replace the belts, the brakes, and a lot more, and now it can be yours on Cars and Bids. So, when you finish watching this video, click the link in the description below to head over to the live auction for this 612, and you can bid on it and buy it and own this 612 Scaglietti only on Cars and Bids. So let's talk 612. Back when this car came out in 2005, enthusiasts complained that the styling wasn't exactly what we would call traditional from Ferrari, and frankly, it looked a bit unusual. Of course, Ferrari later replaced this car with the FF, which made the 612 look completely reasonable by comparison, but back in 2005, this was a big departure from the norm for Ferrari styling. And considering what it cost, that meant slow sales. Most of these had sticker prices of around $300,000 when they were new back 15 years ago, and that was a lot of money to pay for an interesting design. Most people didn't pay it, and as a result, these were pretty slow sellers. But now they're a total bargain. Early 612 models like this one go for around $100,000 or less, and that's a lot of car for the money. Up front, you have a naturally aspirated V12 with 540 horsepower. This will do 0 to 60 in 4.2 seconds, and it'll hit 200 miles an hour. It also has 4 seats and relatively modern technology. Get past the looks, and you have a pretty impressive car on your hands, as I will show you today. First, I'm going to take you on a tour of the 612 and show you all of its interesting quirks and features. Then I'll get it out on the road and drive it, and then I'll give it a Doug's score. Alright, I'm going to start the quirks and features of the 612 Scaglietti in back, maybe surprisingly, but this was a grand touring Ferrari, not like those 2-seat sports cars. You were supposed to be able to use this car to take your whole family on a grand tour throughout Europe with ease. So, getting back here, you pull up this little latch, push the seat forward, and then it moves forward automatically and gives you access to the back seat where you will find a surprisingly large amount of amenities. For instance, this armrest folds down and it's surprisingly comfortable. Nice and plush, very cushiony, and it has some nice stitching on it. Looks very nice, even though it will probably rarely get used. You also have this little cubby where you can store a cell phone back here. You have your own climate vent in the back, which is rare to see in a 2-door car, especially one with like a sporty Focus, but the 612 has it to make sure rear passengers are especially comfortable. And there are even more amenities in the back seat. You have an ashtray back here in case you want to smoke while you're being driven around on your grand tour sitting in the back of your 612. You also have coat hooks in the back where you can hang your coats, of course. The kind of important business person with a 612 would need that feature. And you even have child seat anchors back here. So you can put your child seat and your baby in the back seat of your 612 and then cruise around. It can be used as a family car. There's only one small problem with all that, though. The back seats are really tiny. I will attempt to climb into them now, and it will not go very well. I can get back here, actually a lot easier than you might expect, but you can't really put the front seat back. It doesn't latch into place, and there's not a lot of legroom in the back. This is not, it should be noted, the tiniest backseat I've gotten into in a Ferrari. It is relatively practical, but it's definitely not designed for adults for long trips. However, if you wanted to take your kids on a grand tour throughout Europe, you could manage with this car. And while they're sitting in the back, they could smoke, thanks to the ashtray. And next up, we move up front in the 612. And one interesting thing here is to start the car, you put the key in and turn it, which may not seem especially interesting, but I think this is the very last Ferrari where that's true. The F430 came out around the same time as the 612. It has a push button starter on the steering wheel. So does the 599, which came out next. So if you missed that old school key in and twist it phenomenon, the 612, I think, is the last Ferrari to offer it. Now, like I said, those other Ferraris have a start button on the steering wheel. The 612 also has some buttons on the wheel, but not start. Over on the right, you have the sport button. Press that and you go into sport mode. And right below that, one with CST crossed off. You press that and it turns off your traction control. More interesting are the buttons over on the left. One says mode, and if you push that, it brings up an entire list of different menu items on the little screen in the gauge cluster. But how do you scroll through this menu? There's no like scroll buttons on the steering wheel. How do you actually move through your different menu choices? Aha, they've hidden a little scrolly switch on the back side of the steering wheel. You can see it here, and you push it up or down to scroll through the different menu items. And there's also a button in the center that allows you to click on something or to select something. This wouldn't be especially odd except for the fact that they have another button just like this on the other side of the steering wheel, and it does the exact same thing. So you can scroll through the menus with your left hand, or you can scroll through the menus with your right hand. Now, a lot of people would have said, well, maybe the one on the right should be the volume control for the stereo, which makes sense, but that's not what Ferrari did. You have two separate ways to scroll through your gauge cluster screen menus in this car, but you can't control volume from the steering wheel. The Italians always have some interesting quirks. And by the way, on the subject of that screen in the gauge cluster, I have to say, I think this is a pretty good screen for a car that's 15 years old. It's multicolor, it's surprisingly high resolution, and it provides pretty good information. You can press the display button on the steering wheel to scroll through various different displays, and it'll show you like your vehicle temperatures, your current tire pressures, and it will even show you your trip odometer averages, although you will notice that average fuel economy is not one of the items that is mentioned on this little screen, because if you have one of these, they figure you don't really care, and they're probably right. But overall, I think that screen is surprisingly nice given the age of this car. But the very best feature in the gauge cluster, undoubtedly, is the tachometer. Right in the center, bright yellow. It really gives a sense of occasion to this gauge cluster and to the whole driving thing. It's right below your line of sight, and it just looks really cool. And it goes all the way to 10,000 RPM, even though the car itself, of course, doesn't actually rev that high. It is still cool to see that bright yellow tach right in the center. And next up in this vicinity, to the left of the steering wheel, you can see there is a little plaque here that says Ferrari F1 World Champion. And it shows a picture of their F1 car, and it also shows all the years they won the F1 championship. Ferrari had this plaque on all of its models in this era. They were very proud of all of their Formula One victories, and they wanted to tie in their racing to their road cars, and that plaque is how they did it. Now, at the bottom of this plaque, you also have a little number, and this is the chassis number for this particular car, 145536. This is also the last 6 digits of the VIN, and for Ferrari models, they basically started with number 1 back in the 1940s and have counted up ever since. And the last 6 digits of a Ferrari VIN are essentially consecutive going back to the original Ferrari models. There's some exceptions, but that's generally true. And that little number shows you where in production that your particular car fell, 145536. Kind of neat to know that, and it's also kind of neat to see it in the car itself. There's your Ferrari production number on your little F1 plaque. But anyway, next up we move on to the rest of the interior in this car, and it's kind of a mixed bag, frankly. There are some highlights and there are some not so highlights. One of the things I like the most is the materials in here. Absolutely beautiful, gorgeous leather on every surface, hand stitching everywhere in this interior. Back in 2006, that was especially nice. Most cars, even luxury cars, didn't have like contrast stitching and leather on every surface. It was very unusual then, and it still looks beautiful now. It looks like the kind of finely crafted Italian interior that you would want to see. With that said, the controls in this car, especially for the technology, leave a little to be desired. I especially mean that in reference to the climate controls, which you can see here. It's this sort of dizzying array of dials and buttons and arrows, and there are 5 dials and 5 buttons in this giant climate control thing, and frankly, there's got to be a more efficient and better way to make your climate controls than this. Ferrari had some bizarre climate controls over a lot of years, and this is one of my my least favorite setups they did. And the same is true of the radio. You have this old school Becker radio that was used in a lot of different vehicles, not just Ferraris, but a lot of different brands for a lot of different years, especially throughout the 1990s and early 2000s. And this radio just isn't up to the quality of this car. You can see this screen is this like pixelated black and white display. Doesn't really look all that good, especially when you compare it to the rather nice gauge cluster screen that I showed you, which is full color and high resolution. I think the 612 was the very last Ferrari to use this Becker radio, and by the time this car came out, it was time to get rid of that system, and so it's nice that this was the end. But frankly, it would have been nicer if they had gotten rid of it before. And by the way, my favorite quirk of this radio always was, if you want to turn it on, you press the on button, of course, and then you turn it on. If you want to turn it off, you press the on button again. This is a really well thought through radio head unit. I'm glad Ferrari put it in so many vehicles over so many years. Now next up, another interesting item in this interior, we move on to the center console and you can see the gear selector area. This car had Ferrari's F1 transmission, and to put it into gear, you have this dainty little gear shift that looks ridiculous compared to basically every other shift lever, but that is how you operated it. To put the car into reverse, you would pull back on the little shift lever and then the car was in reverse, and to put the car into drive, you would push forward on the shift lever and then you were in drive. Now from there, you didn't have to use the little gear lever anymore. You would use the paddles to shift gears after that, and so that little gear lever was really only to get you started. But it's small and it's weird and it feels kind of flimsy, but that's how you change the gears, at least initially in this car. Now it's worth noting you could drive this car without using the paddles, which was a nice feature to have in a grand touring vehicle such as this. You just press the little auto button in the gear selector area in the center console, and then you were in automatic mode. You also have a button here marked F1S. That was F1 transmission sport mode, and I guess it gave you like quicker shifts to make you feel sportier as you drove along. Next up, other interesting controls in the center console. You see you have 3 buttons in here: lock, unlock, and open. Lock and unlock are obvious, that's for the doors, but open is for the glove box. You press that and the glove box opens up. I guess Ferrari didn't want to use a latch for whatever reason, so instead you have a separate glove box open button that isn't intuitively anywhere near the glove box itself. And by the way, those little red and green buttons in the center console you may have noticed, those are for phone calls. Green would answer the phone call using Bluetooth and red would hang up. There was initially a phone diagram on these buttons, but it has worn off over the years, but that is what they do. And next up we move on to the trunk in the 612, which is a little smaller than you'd expect for a grand touring, practical, usable car, but it's bigger than what you'd find on a normal Ferrari sports car, so it is reasonably practical, at least by Ferrari standards. My favorite thing about this trunk is undoubtedly on the inside of the trunk lid, the little release you pull to climb out if someone has kidnapped you has an image of someone jumping out of a Ferrari's trunk. Not just a generic car, but an actual Ferrari 550 Maranello. They went to the trouble of creating the actual car in that trunk release latch design, and that is just cool to see. Now, unfortunately, it's not this car. Like I said, it's a 550 Maranello, but it is still cool attention to detail. Also cool in this trunk, if you lift up the lower floor of the trunk, you can see there is like a sub-trunk underneath that where you can store more cargo if you don't want people to find it or you don't want it to be seen. And below that, you lift up that little lower floor, and that's where all the books are for this car. The owner's manual, there's also like a tire changing kit in here, and you can see they are in this beautiful leather casing. Even the owner's manual pouch looks better in a Ferrari. Again, this gorgeous Italian leather, like the interior has, that really says craftsmanship and makes you feel luxurious. And next up, we move under the hood of the 612, and you can see the beautiful engine. Beautiful for 2 reasons. One, because it's a naturally aspirated V12, and that is just a thing of beauty to begin, but also it just looks cool. Take a look at this engine. Very different from the engine in your car, I strongly suspect. Now, a couple of interesting things about this engine. For one thing, this car attracted a lot of criticism for its long front end. And when you get under the hood, you can see the engine didn't really take advantage of that long front end. It's placed very far back in the engine bay behind the front wheels. Obviously, for weight distribution purposes, you don't really want a heavy engine hanging out too far in the front. But you can see a lot of this front stuff is not engine related and probably could have been compacted to make the front end a little smaller and satisfy some of the design critics. I'll get to design in just a second. Now, the other interesting thing about this engine, 5.7 liter V12, about 540 horsepower. This car was being built around the same time as the 599, which had a 6 liter V12. interestingly, they are completely different engines. The engine in the 612 was related to the one in the Ferrari 550 Maranello and the 575, whereas the 599 had a completely new V12. So even though these cars were being built at around the same time with around the same displacement V12, it was two totally different powertrains. And it's worth noting, because the 612 used the older engine design, it is belt driven rather than chain driven like the newer engines, meaning you have to do belt services every few years to keep the engine running. This is a pretty pricey service, but this particular 612 just had it done, like I mentioned earlier. And finally, we move on to styling, although really I want to start with design, because the 4-seat V12 Ferrari has been a matter of tradition with Ferrari for many years. They've built a 4-seat front-engine V12 car going back decades, and the 612 was the next one in line. Now, trying to combine Ferrari sporty styling with a 4-seater with a big engine up front can lead to some interesting and weird-looking cars. The 456, which came right before the 612, was a gorgeous vehicle. The 612 was a little less gorgeous. A lot of criticism was leveled at this car at the time that the wheelbase was simply too long, that the front end was simply too long, that it just had some awkward styling and awkward proportions compared to the rest of Ferrari's lineup and compared to what people expect from Ferrari design. Now, the interesting thing is, after the 612, Ferrari really shook things up with the FF, which totally got rid of every preconception. Suddenly it was a hatchback and it had all-wheel drive and everything changed. And that car was such a radical departure from traditional Ferrari that, frankly, I think it has caused the 612 to start growing on me a bit, to be completely honest. And when I see them now, which is rarely, I actually think they're reasonably attractive cars. Not beautiful, but head-turning and interesting and cool. But regardless of your opinion, it is undoubtedly an interesting design, very unique, and very opinion-splitting, especially at the time, given that these cost like $250,000 to $300,000 to buy a car that most people agreed was not Ferrari's most beautiful effort. And so those are the quirks and features of the Ferrari 612 Scaglietti. Now it's time to get it out on the road and see how it drives. All right, driving the 612 Scaglietti, and I'm here with my friend, the GT3 RS watering can. Now, two interesting things that have grown on me since this car first came out. One is the styling, the other is the transmission. Let's talk styling. When this car came out, it was kind of universally despised as being really weird looking. But just like anything, over time, you know, you've normalized the design a little bit, and frankly, I find it to be not so bad anymore. I think it's still not a very beautiful car, but I don't know, it's starting to get sort of a classic look to it, and I think it's kind of cool, frankly. But obviously, that one is subjective. One that is a little bit more interesting to me, that surprises me, that has grown on me, is the transmission. When these F1 transmissioned cars were coming out, you could tell it just was laggy, and there was this gap when you were shifting, and those also got a lot of complaints. But over time, I've come to actually appreciate these F1 transmissions for feeling more mechanical than modern dual clutches. I love a dual clutch transmission. They're amazing, but they're so fast and so effortless. There's something kind of nice about pulling the paddle and feeling that like mechanical upshift, even though there is a bit of a lag. At the time this car was new, you knew that lag was keeping you from being the fastest. But now, so many cars are faster than this one, that's not really your goal anymore. You know you're not the fastest. And there's something kind of nice about shifting gears in one of these old F1 transmission cars, and I've started to notice that I feel that way more and more about all these sort of sequential automatics. Now, I want to be clear, the early ones are still a nightmare, but this F1A was a very late effort from Ferrari for a sequential manual. The shifts are pretty quick, it's pretty reliable, and so that helps. But anyway, let's get on to the overall driving experience of this car. The thing I always liked the most about this car was the way it drove. I worked at a Ferrari dealer when this car came out back in that era. It was the summer of '08, I was working there, but these were new. And, you know, no one was buying them. No one wanted this car. It was so weird looking, everybody thought. But I remember I got to drive one from Denver to Boulder, a little north of Boulder, like over an hour, one way. And it was the coolest. It was so fast, it handled so well. And at the time, it made sense why no one was buying them. 300 grand for a car that was kind of unattractive. But now, I mean, these are like 80, 90, 100. and 450 horsepower, naturally aspirated V12, relatively reliable car. This car just had a major service done, but an unusually major one. Like probably a lot of stuff had built up and they just took care of it all. But I think you can get away with owning this car for maybe the cost of a few grand a year, and you get a naturally aspirated V12. And here's the real secret about the 612, it drives great. It handles better than anybody thinks. It handles on rails, incredibly good, excellent suspension, excellent steering feel. Just perfectly poised and perfectly balanced and perfectly linear. You go to turn and very predictable, very easy, and it's really wonderful to drive. And also another great benefit about this car, it's gonna sound like a joke when I say this, but I'm not kidding. When you're driving it, you don't have to look at it, which is, I know it sounds humorous, but the truth is you don't have to think about, oh, this is a weird looking car, whatever. No matter your opinion on the style, when you get behind the wheel, it is still a naturally aspirated V12 that handles great and is bargain priced by today's standards. And so in my opinion, this car, you have some really cool, it's an intersection of some really cool things. It's relatively modern performance, relatively modern tech and styling and all that, but you pay a lot less than you would for basically any other modern Ferrari. These have just lost so much value, and yet they're still incredibly fun to drive. And they are fast, by the way. Ooh, it feels quick. It's got a ton of torque, and it feels like it's got just a lot to give. And that was another thing about this car. It always felt fast, and frankly, in my mind, it still does feel fast, and it's really impressive. You get up there high in the range. Oh, whew. It's fun. It's fast and it's fun and it's exciting. It was supposed to be a Ferrari that you really could plod along and have amazing fun with, or you could just kind of chill and relax and fly under the radar. And a lot of people I know who have these or have had them say, people don't come up to them on the street. People have no clue that they're in a Ferrari unless you know. And there's something to be said for that. If it's your first Ferrari, you want everybody to come up to you, bright red, 430 mid-engine. But you know, your 10th Ferrari, maybe you just want to enjoy the experience yourself without having to deal with members of the public. And this was the right car for that. You still had all the fun without any of the flash. And so that's the Ferrari 612 Scaglietti. This is an impressive car. Styling aside, it offers a lot of great stuff. You have V12 power, amazing performance, a beautiful interior, and a surprisingly practical overall package. I kind of liked these cars back when they were new, but I really like them now that they've achieved bargain status and they're a lot more affordable than they once were. And you can experience it for yourself by buying this one on Cars and Bids. Anyway, now it's time to give the 612 a Doug's score. Starting with the weekend categories and styling, the 612 is, well, it wasn't regarded as the most beautiful Ferrari of its era, although I think the design is aging reasonably well. Still, it gets a 5 out of 10. Acceleration does 0 to 60 in the low 4-second range, and it gets a 7 out of 10. Handling is sharp, sharper than you'd expect, and it gets a 7 out of 10. Fun factor is also pretty high. Even though it's a luxury grand tour, it's surprisingly thrilling to drive, and it gets a 7 out of 10. Finally, cool factor. These weren't the coolest cars on the planet when they were new, but as they've become more affordable, enthusiasts have started noticing them more, and they're getting less common to see around. It gets a 7 out of 10 for a total weekend score of 33 out of 50. Next up are the daily categories and features. The 612 was reasonably well equipped for its day, but nothing crazy, and it gets a 4 out of 10. Comfort is okay, about what you'd expect for a car like this, and it gets a 5 out of 10. Quality is good, the interior is nice with leather everywhere. Reliability is also known to be reasonably strong on these, though it's still a Ferrari with pricey repairs, and it gets a 7 out of 10. Practicality is normal for a 4-seat coupe, and it gets a 4 out of 10. Finally, value, and these have become great ones. A reasonably reliable V12 powered Ferrari with modern performance. These now sell for under $100,000 pretty often, and I think that's such a deal. It gets an 8 out of 10 for a total daily score of 28 out of 50. Added up, and the Doug score is 61 out of 100, which places it here against relevant cars. The 612 is fast and fun and reasonably affordable, even to own and operate. And frankly, I think it's easy to look past the controversial styling given this car's benefits.